Back to Morning Report. Well, the leader of the opposition, Simon Bridges, has hit out at the government for compensating meth crooks after Housing New Zealand said it would compensate people who are evicted from state houses after dodgy meth testing. They'll be reimbursed for things like lost household items, moving costs and all the meth-related debt. Well, Simon Bridges joins me now in the Auckland studio. Tēnā koe, good morning to you.
Kia ora, Guy.
Are you saying that the people who were evicted from these houses were meth crooks?
Well, let's be clear what happened here. We've got a situation where this was done because of the concern, and we accept now a test that was too high or low, I suppose, depending how you look at it, to get to the safety. Then what happened is, and Housing New Zealand's chief executive has confirmed this, is where those people, it could not be, the tenants, it could not be determined that they had caused the harm, and let's not spell out what that is. That is smoking or indeed cooking methamphetamine P. In those cases, they actually were compensated some $3,000. My point is simply this. You are then left with about 800 cases, as I understand it, where in fact Housing New Zealand determined, and the chief executive confirmed this over the weekend, that the tenants did cause the harm through the smoking or the cooking. Now, rehousing is one thing, but actually compensating those tenants for unlawful behaviour, for breaking their tenancy, I think is wrong.
Are you aware that there was no consistent baseline testing in these Housing New Zealand homes?
Well, in fact, my understanding is reasonably simple, and it goes on the basis of what I've seen from the interviews with the Chief Executive of Housing New Zealand and advice I've had, and it's this. The standard we all accept now, too, as I say, high, but actually no one that I am aware of is testing or is challenging, I should say, not even Phil Twyford, who has changed his tune on this in Parliament, that the actual testing for methamphetamine was in any way wrong. And so I come back to it.
Come back to my question. Are you aware that there was no consistent baseline testing?
You mean testing for the presence of methamphetamine in those
if you
homes?
Take the tenancy, there was no test to make sure that it was definitely you who did it. Because if there's not a baseline test before you moved in, and then they find a tiny amount of meth in and say that you've done it, there's no way to determine who actually is responsible for that, is there?
Well, actually, the Housing New Zealand chief executive has been crystal clear in what he has said. He has said where they were not able to determine that it was those tenants, in fact, they got compensation. Right? So then you come to that other group where actually his point, again, is crystal clear. Housing New Zealand could determine that in fact there was smoking or cooking in that premises.
Well, how could they do that without a baseline test, and how could you know that it wasn't someone else who'd come round at some point and smoked meth in a house?
Well, because,
I mean, how can you say, and it's a big call for you to say it as leader of the opposition, one of the most senior politicians in New Zealand, that these are all, quote, meth crooks? Compensation for meth crooks.
Well, not all. Actually,
no, you've said it. You've said it. I'm looking at your quote now. Compensation for meth crooks. You're saying that all of those 800 people are meth crooks.
Because quite simply, if it has been determined that there was smoking or cooking of P, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's incredibly serious. This is a Class A drug.
You're a former Crown prosecutor. Do you think it's good enough evidence to say, oh, you did it, even though if it isn't a baseline test in the house before you moved in?
This is not evidence to a criminal standard where that has been established. I accept what you're saying.
Well, there you go. So why have you used the word meth crooks? What's a crook?
Because actually paying people where Housing New Zealand has determined they have smoked or cooked P, those tenants have, I'm sorry, that is wrong. That is money that should not be going to them. Of course we should be compassionate. Of course we should rehouse. Of course we should be looking for the interests of the children. But I think it is wrong to do what Phil Twyford is doing here, where there has been, I suppose, prima facie establishment of the smoking or cooking of P, to then go out, give money and wipe debts on the back of that, when presumably in these cases, you're talking about Housing New Zealand having received complaints, Housing New Zealand having gone out, tests having been done.
But you're lumping them in with cooking it as well, which seems incredibly unlikely given the very small residues that were found. I mean, right?
No, well, look, in 800 cases, I'm sure a number of them, and maybe most of them, were for the smoking of pea. But there certainly would have been cooking cases amongst those. And so I think it's factually right to say there will be people here who are being paid compensation when they were clearly unlawful and they were clearly in breach of their tenancy.
Okay.
And I think we do need to distinguish between rehousing, as I say, where there's a compassionate case for that, and actually doing what, as I say, and I certainly think most New Zealanders say is wrong, and that's compensating.
You have been critical of the so-called no eviction policy. This is Housing New Zealand and the government saying that they're not going to boot people out of state houses if they have been smoking meth. Do you think that people who smoke meth in state houses should be booted out of their state house?
Well, I think you've got to be very careful about the message you're sending.
Well, I'm asking you. What is it? Should they be booted out?
I think if you're smoking a Class A drug consistently in a state house, when there are 9,000 people at the moment and families waiting for a state house, I think actually where it's determined that it is you, you should at the very least go into the queue rather than while that house is made safe, rather than having actually other people. So
you would have a policy of evicting people from state houses for smoking pea?
No, I think if you look at the circumstance, let's go through it. If you look at the circumstance of what's come around here, this was about safety, right? They went in and they found what they found.
I've moved on now. I'm asking you because I've seen the press release from Judith Collins in June about this issue, critical of the government's no eviction policy. And I'm asking you a pretty simple question. Would you boot out people from state houses for smoking meth?
And I'll give you a simple answer. I'm not going to say in every instance it's going to be the same policy, but I am going to say this to you. The idea of having a no ifs, no buts eviction policy is wrong because it sends the wrong message, and it does mean for clearly terrible antisocial behaviour that may in instances, and I've dealt with these cases as local member of parliament, be terrorising community. There is no recourse for Housing New Zealand. That is got to be wrong and repugnant actually to communities and New Zealanders.
A couple of quick questions on the economy to finish. A good GDP number, the highest in 2 years. I see AAA credit rating confirmed by 2 credit rating agencies over the last few days. Doesn't this show that the business confidence concerns, and indeed many of your own criticisms, amounts in very little, and the economy's going just fine?
No, because my point has never been New Zealand's going to hell in a handbasket and we're heading for recession. That the tragedy for me has always been what could have and was forecast being more like 3.5-4% growth is going to be a good percent or more under that. And that is a tragedy. It's $1 billion the government doesn't have to invest. It's less money in New Zealanders' pockets. I would simply say a couple of other things. Firstly, remember this is for the June quarter. And so I think actually if you look at that business confidence and consumer confidence, we're talking about figures and a sense amongst those New Zealand businesses and consumers post that. Let's see what the rest of this year does. And what is also true, I think, is if you look underneath that figure in GDP per capita, whereas for a long time at 1.6 we were beating Aussie.
It wasn't very fresh under you either.
I tell you what.
GDP per capita.
Well, I tell you what. It's now 0.7, and so in terms of once having been ahead of Aussie, we're now going back in real terms. I think that explains why New Zealanders are leaving 2,500 this year net for Australia.
Thanks for your time this morning. That's Simon Bridges, who's, of course, the leader of the National Party. It's 16 minutes to 8.
Just a quick bit of traffic. Motorists in Queenstown being urged to take extra care around the Crown Range Road, with ice expected on the road on top of the forecast snow